Hello, and welcome to Artificial Developer Intelligence, a podcast where two self-proclaimed filthy casuals navigate the ever-changing AI-enabled software engineering landscape. I'm Shimin and Dan, a software developer, and with me today is my co-host, Dan. It's not a conspiracy if my 401k depends on it, Lasky. Dan, happy belated birthday. What is your
Thanks.
favorite conspiracy theory?
Well, right now, and this is not a widely accepted one, but right now it's definitely that the game Slay the Spire, which is heavily RNG dependent if you haven't played it, has a different RNG on different platforms. And I'm clearly playing on the platform with the worst RNG, and that's why I'm terrible at it.
You should sacrifice some virgins to the RNG gods. That should definitely help.
Works every time. On today's podcast, we're going to be going through the AI news of this week. As you know, the space moves really quickly, so we'll try to cover the most interesting articles that we uncovered this week, quickly followed by
a technique corner where we discuss some interesting techniques we've been using when working with AI.
And then on to the post of the week. This week, we're going to be digging into whether or not AGI itself is a conspiracy theory. So nice little lead in there. And then we will be doing
a deep dive segment where we're going to go over two items this week. One, which is a blog post that covers some new LLM architectures beyond the standard full attention models. We'll also talk about a new Anthropic paper that experiments with value alignment on various large language models. And then it's my favorite segment.
If you've made it this far in the podcast, you get to listen to me rant about things because, why not? That's what I do all the time anyway. And then finally,
will be your favorite segment, which is 2 minutes to midnight, where we discuss where we are as we are approaching the AI bubble, whether or not it's going to burst tomorrow, a month from now, maybe never. You never know. First up, we have an article from the Register called AI benchmarks are a bad joke and LLMs makers are the ones laughing, in which we look at a new study from the Oxford Internet Institute that casts doubt on the reliability of existing AI benchmarks. The researchers found that only 16% of the 445 prominent benchmark uses rigorous scientific methods, with many failing to even define the concepts like reasoning and harmlessness. So as we know, most models released today have the charts for their performance on various AI benchmarks. Mm-hmm. Some of the ones that I look at the most are the SWE bench verified. There are also the AIM 2025, the MMMU, and the Health Bench Hard. So when we look at the performance of the models on these benchmarks, how good are these benchmarks? Is a question.
Yeah.
Dan, have you looked at these benchmarks?
No, not in detail, but I've definitely seen plenty of articles out there that are essentially claiming that they're gamed to some degree because they can train specifically for the questions that are in the benchmarks. To what degree that's true, I have no idea, but it is fascinating. And I guess generally, I always think about the time that, like, one of my friends in college a long time ago, his first job out of school was working for a large software company that created graphics drivers, or dealt with graphics drivers, I should say, from multiple vendors. And one of the vendors that he worked with was known for cheating quite a bit in their driver code so that it would look better on benchmarks than it actually performed in the real world. I just feel like that's a very human thing to want to game the system once there's a system to game.
Did your friend work for the graphics unit of Volkswagen? Is that what happened?
No, I was trying very hard not to name names, but he worked for Microsoft and was dealing with both at the time it was ATI, so this dates my story a little bit, but ATI and NVIDIA drivers pretty frequently.
So I thought this article is really interesting because we've heard a lot about companies gaming benchmarks. They may have benchmark data in their training set. They may have, there are numerous ways to game the system. So I decided to take a look at the SWE bench, the software engineering bench, and it looks like how they formulated the benchmark is they took 12 popular Python repositories and they took pull requests for those repositories that are associated with an issue. And they essentially asked the AI in a sandbox Docker container environment to write code to resolve the issue that was listed in the GitHub issues and run the test both before and after the model claims that it has done the work. And on the face of it, that feels pretty good to me.
But is it like they're not randomizing that set? It's always the same issues, I'm assuming?
Yeah.
Because otherwise it wouldn't be a very good benchmark. But
right. Correct.
Yeah, I do wonder in that situation what prevents someone from just training that exact thing.
We know models have the ability to remember a large corpus of text. So if those GitHub repos were part of its training set, and since they were all public, there's definitely a chance that the models have seen the answer. But I do think the article itself has a bit of a clickbaity title.
For sure.
I wouldn't go as far as,
so, take it with a grain of salt.
Yes. So I pulled up the underlying paper that is called Measuring What Matters, Construct Validity in Large Language Model Benchmarks. And they actually have a very sensible set of recommendations. They recommend that the benchmark creators to define the phenomenon, such as, define what reasoning is, to measure the phenomenon and only the phenomenon, which seems reasonable, and control for unrelated tasks that may affect the results. Then to construct a representative dataset for the task before acknowledging limitations of reusing dataset, and then prepare for containment, which we just spoke about earlier. These are all very reasonable recommendations.
Right. Significantly less clickbaity than the title might imply.
Yes. So I like the recommendations. I think it makes sense. I think we've been move fast and worry about the definitions later land, which with the speed that everything has been moving lately, I totally understand. And at the end of the day, I feel like the SWE benchmark is pretty good when it comes to measuring how well a model can actually write code that
and
can help us.
Real tasks, real world tasks.
Right. Yeah. But we definitely should keep that in mind. Any last words? Benchmarks suck. Conspiracy.
I mean, I'm sad that the title of that article wasn't. We could make some slight improvements to benchmarking to have it be much more realistic and rigorous, but it is what it is.
It is what it is. Speaking of it, ThoughtWorks and its Tech Radar. Have you come across it? For those who do not know what the technology radar is, ThoughtWorks, which is a contracting consultant company, software development company, famous for its pair programming and TDD workflow. I interviewed with them once. I was much younger at the time, and I didn't know what a decorator was in Java. And that's, I think, what cost me the job. But I know what a decorator is now, so take
All
that,
right.
ThoughtWorks.
And if you don't, Claude does. So
yes, there we go.
Yeah, I'm quite familiar with them. I did over a 2-year engagement at one point in my career with them, and actually wound up working with one of the guys that did the Tech Radar for quite a while. So
wow, cool. So your Tech Radar is very familiar to you. They release them twice a year, and the November 2025 issue just came out. What I found really interesting, other than recommending Tech Radar as a whole for software developers to keep a tab on the technology landscape, is it is wild how AI-centric the November 2025 Tech Radar is. I am looking at it right now. I can hardly find any technologies out there that is not AI or AI adjacent. There are two. There's Pydantic, which is really great. It's like a ORM for Python. And there's PNPM, which I know you like. I am trying to convince my team to adopt it, but pretty much everything else on this list is entirely AI driven.
That doesn't surprise me too much. I mean, I do think, as you mentioned, indicative of the trends, but also the Tech Radar, at least in my experience, has always got a little hype factor in it too. So they're certainly not immune to that. Not that I think PNPM is hype, for example, but I recall while we were doing the engagement with them, the Tech Radar was pushing micro front ends really hard. see too many micro front ends these days, so there's
I
definitely an element of trendiness in it.
Yeah, I got strong feelings for micro front end that are not positive. But
Could save them for
pre-commit
Dan's
hooks,
round.
pre-commit hooks is definitely I really like that, and that's not AI related. And it's on the November 2025 issue. I kind of was going over the November issue with the April issue, and I feel like we were already fairly along the AI hype train back in April. And in April, the adopt the techniques category, I'm seeing in the adopt quadrant, I'm seeing data product thinking, fuzz testing, software bill of goods, and threat modeling. I am just double checking to make sure I am indeed looking at the 2020 April of this year issue, because I'm seeing 0 AI items there.
It's fair.
For platform, they are still adopting GitLab CI/CD. So it's kind of just wild how in the last 6 months, like the entire radar has been shifted, which I guess is why we're doing this podcast. Things are moving incredibly quickly.
Well, yeah, it's been here for a bit, but it feels like maybe in the last 6 months to a year that it's really gotten good for some definitions of good. So I'm not
Yeah.
surprised
Or
that it's shifting.
usefulness plus hype, kind of somewhere along there.
Yeah. Bell curve between usefulness. I know you can't.
We're
Yeah.
gonna try. Okay. Moving on to the technique corner. I know last week, Dan, you talked about the slash ketchup.
Mm-hmm.
That was from this article, How I Use Every Cloud Code Feature on Substack, I believe, by Shibu Shankar's Substack. And this week, I've got a chance to play around with one of the other ideas from the same article, which is to ask Claude Code to use its own built-in task to spawn sub-agents, as opposed to having lots of different agent.markdown files and kind of predefine the workflow that Claude Code is supposed to do. I thought this was interesting because it is against the Claude Code best practice for their sub-agent usage, right? Like I'm looking at the effective context engineering for AI agents article right on Anthropic's blog, and in there's a whole section about using sub-agent architecture to work as a way to work around context limitations,
Mm-hmm.
which I think having Claude Code generate its own agents is still doing the same thing by working as a workaround around context limitations, but the approach of maybe the agent already knows how to separate out the tasks into subagents is superior. So I've given that a try in some of my projects this week, and I found it to be quite useful. Instead of writing down a long agents markdown and define everything you need in a code review, often using Claude Code to help me, modify and improve the agents markdown file, just ask Claude to do it, and I think it does a pretty good job. I haven't done a ton with the actual built-in cloning yet. I still ask it to define its agents. So there's still a concept of like, here's an agent you can use, as opposed to use an agent whenever you feel appropriate. So I feel like I'm still
Gotcha.
having it on a shorter leash, but I found it to be very helpful.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see if they keep pushing that or if it becomes irrelevant because it seems like context windows keep doubling every 6 to 8 months. I'm sure we'll hit some limit there, like memory limitations, but like maybe it will be irrelevant with the next doubling, but maybe not. And we'll actually go even more agentic with some of these things.
And context length doubling, we're gonna come back to that later. Yeah. So I agree. Yeah. All right. For the article of the week, we have a article from MIT Technology Review called How AGI Became the Most Consequential Conspiracy Theory of Our Time.
I'm really angry that they didn't pick the RNG one, but okay, we'll go with it.
Okay. Inside the article states that artificial general intelligence has ceased to become a merely technical goal and is now the driving conspiracy theory in at least the tech sector in the United States. It also contends that the narrative functions as a convenient but unfalsifiable myth that tech elites can use to drive up valuation up, as well as get their workers to work harder, but at the same time avoid regulation by promising a utopia that only they can give us. So the article says we should stop treating AGI like an inevitability and see it more as a way for big tech to concentrate power. There are some really interesting quotes from or stories from the article that I would like to mention. For example, in the article, they mentioned that Ila Saltkiver, the former chief scientist at OpenAI, is said to have led the chant of "Feel the AGI" at a team meeting. If that's not culty, I don't know what is. But at the same time, I kind of want to feel the AGI, Dan.
I mean, who doesn't, really? At least in that room, for sure.
Yeah. And I also like this quote. If you are building a conspiracy theory, you need a few things in the mix. A scheme that is flexible enough to sustain belief, even when things don't work out as planned.
Mm-hmm.
And the promise of a better future that could be realized only if believers uncover hidden truth. And a hope for salvation from the horrors of this world.
Right. Which, when you look at it from that perspective, AGI really kind of ticks all the boxes, doesn't it? It will mystically solve all of our problems, I'm sure, including climate change and everything else. And then, we keep trying to get there and we aren't. And the only way to get there is clearly more spending. So let's keep doing it.
Well, we're going to talk about a couple of news items about that this week. But yeah, especially, AGI, like cold fusion, always needs to be 6 months to a year away, because any further than that, you won't be able to recruit people from Jane Street. And if it's any closer, then it's already here. Then what's the point? Right. And I find that to be a paradox that a lot of conspiracies do share. Are you a believer? I know I want to believe.
In AGI. I mean, I think the concept of it certainly exists. What do you mean by believer, really?
Do you believe that our
It's
current,
achievable?
yeah, within our lifetime?
Within our lifetime? I mean, that's a hard thing to predict, because, I mean, if you look at, like, my grandparents, for example, they were alive when there was, horse and buggies in use, maybe not the only thing in use, but they were around.
Mhm.
And by the time they passed away, there was like supersonic jet aircraft and computers and everything else. So, like, by the end of our lifetime, probably, I don't know. Yeah, maybe I'll go back and look at this in 40 years and be like, oh boy. But the thing that makes me question it is, like, look, I'm a filthy casual, as we say on the label of this podcast, but, like, my intuition, which is, not worth very much when it comes to AI stuff, is that Transformers is probably not the architecture that's going to get us there. So who's to say that there won't be some architectural shift with the impact that Transformers already had on large language models? But, like,
Right.
Are we there now? Or can this technology scale to get us there? It doesn't feel like it to me. I think in the S curve of technologies, right, where you start off with nothing for kind of a long time, as we've seen with ML, and then all of a sudden you hit something and you go rocket ship up to the sun, like we've done with large language models. It feels kind of like we're in the flattening part of the S curve, and I base that on things like the average, / media response to GPT-5 and stuff like that, right? Where people were underwhelmed by the usage, regardless of whether or not it's actually better statistically. Like, there's the perception that it's underwhelming, and I think that's something that's worth paying attention to.
Well, Ilya, the former chief scientist of OpenAI, agrees with you. He gave a pretty famous speech earlier this year or it might have even been last year, where he talked about how we're running out of data for training at least large language model based AIs now. That's so he foresees a slowdown in model improvement.
Yeah, and also, like, combine it with stuff like the Apple paper, right, where they've sort of proven to some degree that, like, reasoning isn't really reasoning, and a lot of the reasoning that is happening is only kind of works within the boundaries of things that are fairly well-defined problems, like software, right? So if you're going to call it, we've built this thing that's great for coding, but is that AGI? Not really, because you should be able to give it, like, a really advanced chemistry problem that it's never seen before and get a reasonable answer. Is it still a very useful tool? I think so, but like, yeah, I don't know.
There's a whole theory that, or a whole field of RL researchers who think that in order to achieve true AGI, we need the AI to have sensory input like humans. And there has been an argument that like that's one area where China is doing a much better job than
Interesting.
the United States. Whereas in the US, we are all looking for AGI as salvation. In China, they are applying AI in factories, dark factories. So they are working with robotics and the intersection of machines and intelligence. So some of their models have more actual perception feedback. And, sure, there are lots of technological challenges, memories, etc. But that may be a closer parallel to what
Yeah,
AGI
I'm
actually
aware of at
is.
least one US startup that's doing something like that too. They're trying to have like AI run construction equipment,
Yeah.
like
But I
backhoes and
think
stuff like
the
that.
argument is they're doing it. It's already there as opposed to kind of in the research phase. So within our lifetime, yes, but maybe not the next few years. I knew you were an optimist. This is
Yeah, well,
good.
what's your take on that?
I'm pretty much in the same boat. I think within our lifetime, when we look back, definitely. I was just reminded when I saw the new AirPod demo and how you get real time translation. We have the Babelfish now, and we just kind of all
Or Star Trek is real.
like
The little
whatever,
hand on your
like we
yeah,
had the technology. Yeah, and our first response is like, well, yeah, like Google cracked it back in like 2018, like have you read the original paper? Like they've already got translation working. But if we give that to, me when I was 7 or so, like we live in the future. So I don't think I think we're gonna keep on moving the goalposts of AGI, and I think that's okay. But in the meantime, the progress is undeniable.
and I would argue the real problem with the translation stuff isn't that it existed. I mean, that was obviously the hard problem to solve, but I feel like we still haven't really solved the how do you use this in a useful way in real life? Because I travel quite a bit internationally. And despite having that on my phone, I've never found a good way to actually use it where you don't like wind up looking like even more of a tourist and an ass than you do without it.
That's a UX problem.
Exactly.
You would also look like a
Spoken like a
tourist.
UX guy, I guess.
If you bring out a Babelfish, you would also look like a tourist.
It's fair.
But speaking of context length doubling every couple of months, at least it felt that way. Our deep dive of the week is the blog post by Sebastian Reska, who writes the Ahead of AI Substack. I see it more as a magazine about the post. The post title is Beyond Standard LLMs, and it describes some of the shortcomings of existing full attention large language models and some of the technological breakthroughs that we've had to solve the problem of context length, actually. To recap, the traditional or the original large language model has what's called a full attention, where you take the string of the full context length tokens and you essentially encode it into a embedding of a certain size. So we have, say, 1024 length token. We use an embedding to reduce that context length down to 512 for each character within the token. And then, so it would be a matrix of size 124 by 512. And then that gets then passed through the full attention mechanism, which you multiply the embedding by a Q matrix, a K matrix, and then you take the Q matrix, multiply it with the K transpose before doing a matrix multiplication on the value matrix to kind of simulate the idea of finding out which tokens in the string you want to pay attention to and what the value of those tokens are. And that's why it's called, attention's all you need is that mechanism of determining which one is important, but also which token is important to which other token. So the bottleneck of that is when you do the Q and K calculation, each one of them is a 512 by, or I should say, it's a 124 by 512. So, so when you do Q matrix multiply K transpose, you have a 124 by 124 matrix. And that is a matrix that is quadratic to the size of the input token length. And that takes up a tremendous amount of memory.
Yep,
So
that makes sense. And as a filthy casual, to me, I've like run Olama and looked at like the KV cache can be composed. Is that the same thing or no?
Yeah, the KV cache is way to solve the problem
I
of
see.
having to
Okay.
generate these humongous matrices.
Gotcha.
So when we and since this product of QK transpose is quadratic to context length, it becomes a problem as we try to
It's
keep the
massive. Yeah.
context length. Yes.
Just why we keep buying GPUs with more and more memory to try to
Right.
scale that one
And so
up.
I'm actually not 100% sure how these 1 million context token models are created, because they are definitely not doing a 1 million by 1 million kind of matrix. Or maybe they are. Maybe that's why we're spending so much money on them.
Yeah. And
This is a part I'm not so
well,
sure
my
about.
understanding is that like typically inference compute doesn't necessarily require like high speed links between the GPUs, whereas you do need it for like model training. So I like, because my first thought is like, oh, maybe they're just like sharing memory or something like that at like a massive scale, but I have no idea. Felt the casual.
Yeah, there are approaches where each one of these QK transpose is a single head. And that's why you hear about multi-headed attention models. Yep. So sometimes the attention portion, the QK portion, gets fused to reduce the overall memory consumption as well.
Interesting.
Because the V tells you, what each token does, but the Q and the K in theory just tells you which ones you should pay attention to. Multiple models can actually share that same attention. So that's one way to reduce memory requirements while training. But this paper also introduced this idea of a linear attention. Then this is the 2020 paper called Transformers or RNNs, Fast Autoregressive Transformer with Linear Attention, where using a kernel function, it is able to reduce the size of the memory usage to a linear of the context length.
Instead of quadratic.
Yeah. So the downside is that is not as effective as the quadratic version, because of course you are losing information when you're using a kernel function to kind of squeeze all that information down to a single value.
So it's not dissimilar from like an audio compressor, essentially. Which is interesting.
I'm nodding, but I'm not 100% sure how an audio compressor works.
Well,
so yes.
I mean, it's you're taking the full dynamic range of like say a symphony, right? And dynamic range is essentially the quietest note, someone rustling the page of the music, right, all the way up to like the banging as bang of a timpani or something like that. And compressor essentially says the range between those two things, squish it. And so it's literally a compressor. You're actually like compressing the audio signal, right? It sounds better to the human ear, which is why we use it a lot in audio stuff. But the fascinating part is that you are in fact losing data in that compression as well. So just, I don't know, trying to link it back to things I know a little bit about instead. That level of math was never my forte.
Yeah, and the math of this blog post is definitely pretty dense, and I can't say I have fully absorbed all of it either. But there are other interesting future directions that this blog post talked about, including the text diffusion model that is the DeepSeek OCR paper that we spoke about last week. That sounds really interesting. I particularly like the graphics for denoising the mask tokens that's in the graphics there. I had always wondered how a text diffusion model handles a situation where a particular slice of text may need to be inserted as you go through another iteration of text diffusion. Using the mask token seems to make sense because they leave a gap for some future string to exist. And then on the next pass through, it's more iterative, but compared to the autoregressive response where a token needs to be generated one at a time, you get multiple passes where multiple tokens gets generated. And I especially find it interesting that the Google results for its Gemini diffusion is on par with the Gemini 2.0 flashlight. Yeah, this is probably a very interesting approach to monitor going forward.
And I assume that the difference is the context cost is cheaper in terms of memory between the two, or
Not necessarily, but large language models generate a single token at a time. So any way you can generate multiple tokens at a time would be a humongous speed up.
that makes sense. And yeah, and I'd seen a lot of that with like inference providers too, where they prefer batch too, because they get quite a bit of
they get a lot of savings from that.
Yep.
Another approach that was mentioned in this blog post is the code world model. I really love this one. Normal, or what I think of traditional large language models, are trained on text and trained on generating a single token at a time given the preceding tokens, right? It's kind of like self-supervised learning is what it's called. But it has no intrinsic understanding of how code behaves because it doesn't actually run a compiler, or it doesn't run a parser. It emulates a parser. It doesn't actually compile the code. So here in this world model approach, they are able to use reinforcement learning to learn how the program actually works.
I found that fascinating too, because I'm also wondering if like at some point it would make sense to essentially come up with a system that trains on like ASTs instead of text. You know, if there's a way to like represent an AST as a vector somehow, which again, math hurts me a little bit there, but it would be fascinating if you could do that. Like having like only a coding one. But then I guess the trick with that is on like how do you instruct it too? It's like write some code to instruct it as well.
Yeah, text is definitely not the most efficient way to communicate with a large language model.
Or between humans either, really, when you think about it.
I'm thinking very hard. Can you tell what I'm thinking right now, Dan?
No, but we could write paragraphs and paragraphs of text to poorly explain what you're thinking right now.
Yes. Yeah, so I find this approach to be super promising, at least in terms of code, where it tries to predict the state of the program as opposed to just what the next token is. And through that, it is able to learn a finer representation of how code actually works and give feedback that way. I think this is probably going to be how future code models are developed.
Huge if true. I know.
I will bet. I'm buying stock. I'm buying stock on the world model approach.
All right.
If I could, I'm buying some options here. So yeah, that was a super interesting blog post about some of the non-standard large language model architecture that I recommend everyone to go check out. Long read, but I feel like I learned a lot even if I didn't absorb everything.
For sure. Yeah, and that blog is great generally too, if you haven't checked it.
Yeah. On another note, we have also a paper from the alignment science group at Anthropic about stress testing model specs, revealing character differences among language models. It's interesting. We have all these ethical concerns as humans, but how do language models handle ethical concerns? Do they handle ethical concerns? When they are asked to make a trade-off between two equally good values, what do they actually do? And this paper goes into exploring how different language models handle these ethical dilemmas differently. One example that they mention here is when they query the model to make a trade-off between social equity and business effectiveness in the specific case of whether an internet company serving both wealthy urban area and low-income rural communities should adopt progressive pricing. Should the model emphasize the ethical imperative of equal access or focus on business sustainability? There's no objectively correct answer, but the models must choose or at least communicate their uncertainty. Do we think are we expecting these models to answer ethical dilemmas that us humans cannot answer effectively? Are we asking too much of them?
It's fair. I mean, I think this kind of comes back to the earlier article about AGI conspiracy theory, in the sense that, like, if we were to somehow unleash this terrifyingly all-powerful intelligence, then alignment matters a lot more than whether or not it writes good code for you day to day. Yeah, I that's a fascinating one, because it's like, humans struggle plenty with ethics around that. And then you could even look at sort of like a zooming out macro level, like, what are the ethics of even like necessarily replacing humans with AI in the first place, right? So like we're so focused on like what AI is doing, but like what about is AI itself ethical, right? I don't know. I'm not sure exactly where I'm going with that, but like it does feel like an awfully high bar, especially when both decisions are potentially like positive in their own way, right?
But I think we could make some categorical conclusions drawn by this paper. Includes Grok is more willing to respond to requests that other models consider harmful, such as creating dark stand-up routines of mental illness, self-harm, and suicide. Some models are definitely happier than others, or at least more constrained than others. And it is good to be able to put some data to the general vibes of like Grok is doing some interesting stuff out there.
Yeah, and I think to some degree that's a reflection of the interests of the parties behind them, right? Like Anthropic is very concerned about safety, and XAI is, shall we say, not very concerned about safety, to the point where they're encouraging relationships with. I think they had a AI-driven avatar system for girlfriends or something that they were putting out there.
I wouldn't know anything about that. Yeah, for sure. It's an area that I think is worth thinking about. Is maybe not even on an ethical level, but when we are giving our models conflicting commands in Claude, in agents.markdown or other kind of agents instruction contexts, like how do they respond to that is definitely an interesting place to learn more about.
Yeah, and like the real world implications of that are fascinating too, because like if these things are like quote unquote smart enough to understand what you're asking of them versus just like being trained to reject certain vectors, essentially, will we get to a point where you ask like Claude to write spyware and it says no, and it's not just because you use the word spyware, it's because like the actual like harm of the thing that you're intending to do with it would be high enough that it's like, no, I shouldn't do that, which is fascinating. But yeah.
Well, we just have to keep our eyes on it going
Exactly.
forward. But speaking of rejecting vectors, I think Dan, this is Dan Trent's corner. What vectors are you rejecting this week?
What vectors am I rejecting? You're making me out to be the bad guy. First I'm the AI skeptic, and now I'm the AI skeptic again. I have a real Claude problem in my life right now, which is to some degree exacerbated by the fact that my current job involves being in meetings quite a bit for a minimum of 3 days a week. And I still feel like I want to have a actual code driven impact on the business and the work that I'm working on. And so I've been relying on Claude more and more, because I can just give it something to do and sit through a 30-minute meeting, not sit through it, be productive in a 30-minute meeting, actually making decisions and stuff at a sort of like broader technical level, and then come back to the little nitty-gritty task that I've given it and see what happened. But I am recently starting to feel like Claude is making me dumber. And I know there's been plenty of ink spilled over this in the press, but like really, it's not that it's making me dumber, right? It's that like two things are happening. One, I'm finding myself reaching for it more and more for things that I necessarily don't need it for. And then the second is that I'm like starting to forget basic stuff in some cases because I'm just like, oh yeah, let Claude do that. You know, I don't need to remember like this piece of syntax or whatever. And like to some degree, maybe it doesn't matter that I remember these things or not, but like I don't like that feeling. And there's always sort of the idea in the back of my mind that I should be able to fire up like Vim or something, you know, and like a staging into a random box and be able to like write software that way. Not that I do that, you know, I use IDEs like some folks do. But, it concerns me that that's a direction that things could go.
You heard it here first, folks. AI is making us dumber.
Yeah, I don't think you did hear it here first. It's all over the place, right?
Yeah, I do wonder if our roles are changing. It just means that we're no longer expected to be able to, write everything using Vim from scratch. Just like we're no longer expected to be able to write assembly using all the x86 commands like the back of our head.
I mean, that's fair, but if that's true, I don't think the industry has caught up to that idea yet. And I do have some questions about it too, because it's like the reason why code exists as like a sort of high level primitive is that it's more efficient to describe things in code than it is in like NLP to some degree. Mostly on the parsing side is really why it is the way it is. But like, even if we sort of ignore the parsing side with something like an LLM, it still takes like sometimes paragraphs of text to describe like one function, you know what I mean? If it's sufficiently complicated. So is it really saving us anything at that point? Do we need something else? Like, I think last week we talked a little bit about the idea of like spec driven development. Do we almost need like a spec language?
A structure.
It's something that maybe is like between English and pseudocode.
Yeah, this is a little embarrassing, but I did ask Claude to help me add a couple of directories to Git ignore like 2 days ago. Speaking of things that I know how to do perfectly by myself, but I was in the zone. It's just like a different workflow. You're in the telling the AI to do a thing mode, and then to switch back into the context of I'm gonna do it myself. Perhaps is a little challenging.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about that last week too. Is like whether or not really the UX of the current agentic coding experiences is really the best. So it would be interesting if things continue to evolve in that space, like companies like Cursor and obviously the foundation companies as well are playing around with it. Maybe someone will do something that's kind of a step change, and you won't necessarily have to split your brain in that way, like ordering mode versus coding mode. But who knows? I don't know.
But will Cursor have enough funding to do that? That brings us to our last segment, and then Dan's favorite segment, 2 Minutes to Midnight, which is a Iron Maiden song about the atomic clock and where we are in the original atomic clock is for the mutually assured destruction and nuclear proliferation. But here we are talking about the AI bubble. So, what are some news that we want to bring up this week for our 2 Minutes to Midnight clock?
So NVIDIA is not the only one that wants to launch rockets with AI on it into space. Google has announced Project Suncatcher, which is Google's plan to put AI data centers in space. And, sort of like the NVIDIA thing, sure, but also what? Like, did the economics of this really make any kind of rational sense?
But they're planning. They're subjecting their TPUs to radiation exposure to make sure that they can stand up to the right amount of outer space radiations. Also, like, do you have a preference between Suncatcher and I think the NVIDIA one was Star Cloud? Which one's the better name?
I don't know. They all sound like super weapons in a James Bond movie to me. So, I'm going to go with the GoldenEye cluster myself
The
personally.
Golden Knight, yes. 007. I also wonder with this amount of satellites in near orbit, like are we just moving closer to Kessler syndrome? Are we is this what's gonna get us over the top and make the lower orbit in,
So,
uninhabitable?
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we're
Yeah.
already rapidly approaching it with the fact that all the comm satellites that are up there.
Yeah, they don't need any help. And my article for the week for 2 minutes to midnight is the OpenAI CFO, Sarah Farah. She made an implication earlier this week that OpenAI is seeking government help in reaching their revenue or
Right.
investment targets.
Because there was a hot mic moment where, well, I guess not really a hot mic. It was just they were interviewing Sam Altman, I believe, and he
Mhm,
was asked how a company with 14 billion in revenue could possibly cover their like 1.2 trillion in
mhm.
commitments over the next few years. And he got extremely angry about the implications about you don't know how much revenue we make.
Yeah, I
But it
saw
is a
another
good
one.
question, isn't it? Like,
Well,
how can
it's
we
a
do
very
that?
good question.
Yeah,
We're talking real money here. I think the word that the CFO used was a backdrop, which is the um, I guess
essentially a
it's a
bailout.
synonym.
Yeah, was
And
really what they were implying. Yeah,
yeah,
it's like
and
akin to what happened to the automakers, not so long ago. So, um,
I feel like if the biggest player in the space is talking about potential government bailout, we are getting closer. And I think
right.
we were at 55 seconds, 30 seconds last week.
hmm And the other article that I think came out this week that we didn't even make the list, and it probably should have, was the Big Short guy
Mm-hmm.
just shorted Nvidia to the tune of $1.1 billion.
Uh,
Just a data point. It's a fascinating one,
worked.
but it's just a data
It worked
point.
for 2 days, and
Yeah.
then the video went up again today. I think so. We're getting closer. What are you gonna do when the bubble bursts? Do you have a bunker ready for that occasion?
Do I have a bunker ready? No. About the best I can do as a seller in that regard. But I I think it's not as catastrophic as everyone makes it out to
Mm,
be. Like, will there be massive impacts to the US economy? Yes. Did we survive the dot-com bust? Yes. Did we survive 2008? Yes. I think that to some degree it'll actually be good for AI, and I know that's a weird thing to say. People will stop throwing AI onto things like mouse drivers, which is definitely a thing I've seen, right?
what?
And look it up. Logitech
I'm
has
gonna look
a
it up after
yeah.
this. Yeah.
And we might stick to things where it's actually, has some hope of being useful. Like maybe that's coding, maybe it's
Mm-hmm.
not, but that's what I think we'll see. And that's what kind of bugs me about this whole debate about, is there really any economic impact from AI, and is it positive or negative? And that's the one area where I agree with all these huge companies is like, we can't know that yet. It's still in the early
Mm-hmm.
stages, and we haven't found what the drivers are really going to be. So, like, that's the one thing that I feel like China really does right with their investment is like they don't give up at the first sign of like, oh, this thing is maybe not useful. If they'd given up at that point, then they wouldn't have the like massive solar production that they have now, right? Because
Right.
like at the time, could solar have driven your whole country's electricity? No. Could it now? Close,
Mm-hmm.
if not maybe actually. And I think, when you look at it through that lens, like Americans have this interesting business philosophy around like if the company isn't crushing it
Mm-hmm.
completely, then it's failed.
Yep.
And I don't think that's necessarily the case here. I think that this is going to require, as we talked about earlier, much, much, much more research
Yep.
and more digging and more evolution of like business cases and use cases and everything else before it really becomes, I mean, it's already something, but before it becomes like something huge, like
Yep.
printing press huge or something like that. So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Just
So
hot take, but hopefully a fascinating one.
On that, I'll take note. I think I was looking at 15 seconds, but I think with that relatively optimistic prediction, I think we can move it back to 20
Well,
seconds.
no, because that's the post-bubble survival, right?
Oh, okay. Okay, so we should move it closer. It should be more like 10. We're waiting to rebuild. This is gonna be very, very much
I
like
mean,
Fallout.
we've got an implication of a government bailout, and we've got yet another space AI program. So
Yeah.
at the very least, it's staying where it is.
All right. Staying where it is, which I think is 30 seconds.
Yeah,
I could bump it up to a little more. Let's do 20 seconds. How's that?
sure.
Deal. And that's a wrap for this week's episode of Artificial Developer Intelligence. Thank you so much for tuning in and spending time with us AI Filthy Casuals. If you enjoyed this week's show, the best way you can support us is by sharing it with a friend who you think will get value from it. And if you really like the show, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It honestly helps more people to discover the show, and we read every single review. Do you have a question, feedback, or a topic you want us to cover? We would love to hear from you. Shoot us an email at humans@adipod.ai. Again, that is humans@adipod.ai. You can find full show notes, transcripts, and links to everything we mentioned today over at our website, www.adipod.ai. Thank you again for listening. We'll catch you on next week's episode.